And today we're going to talk about things that make me happy, because boundaries ultimately make me happy. So we're going to talk about boundaries. I had posted a reel not that long ago in like Facebook and Instagram that was a repost actually from someone that I follow on my social media. Jefferson Fisher is his name, and he was just talking about boundaries, and it got a lot of traction and a lot of comments from people about how do we actually set a boundary, and what do we do if someone doesn't listen to our boundary. And so I'm going to try to cover some of that stuff today, because a lot of people toss around the word boundary, like we talk about that word a lot, except we're not probably all talking about the same thing. And we probably mean different things by it. And so I've read several books on boundaries because I definitely needed some help getting boundaries set in my life, and it's still something I'm constantly working on. And so what I'm going to do for you today is really go through what I have learned about boundaries. I've tried to summarize it for you as best as I possibly can, and talk a little bit about, I'll give you a few examples of what those are, and then how to actually have consequences in place or hold people accountable to following your boundaries. Because I have found that if I don't have boundaries in my life, then things start happening willy-nilly, and I say yes to way more things than I should, and I don't have the ability to get as much stuff done as I normally would. And I really find that I lose my peace, my ability to kind of sail through my days just feeling really good about stuff. And so I'm hoping that maybe learning a bit about this will help you guys too. So how do you know whether you need boundaries or not? Well, in the email I sent to all of you, I did ask a few questions, and these are the important ones. I want you to think about this. Do you frequently feel stressed, overwhelmed, or maybe burnt out by the amount of work that you have to do? Do you maybe struggle to say no to requests from friends or family, or maybe even team members? And maybe there's some people in your life that you avoid a little bit because you feel a little bit uncomfortable around them. And if you answered yes to any of those questions or parts of them, then you might have an issue with boundaries. No guarantees here, but I bet by the end of this, you'll know whether you do or not. All boundary issues really boil down to one thing. And this is why it's so common for women to not have as many boundaries as I think they should. What happens with a boundary issue is that you've allowed your needs to take second place to someone else's. And the one thing I want you to keep in mind throughout all of this is that healthy relationships, be that with your children, your spouse, your family, your friends, really need healthy boundaries. So to get a little bit technical for a second, there are 6 types of boundaries. There are physical boundaries, there are sexual boundaries, there are intellectual boundaries, emotional boundaries, material boundaries, and time boundaries. And many of the boundaries that we have in our world are coded into our culture. And so they will vary culture to culture. But something like personal space is encoded into our culture, and you don't usually need to state them. But there are other boundaries that are more individual, and these are the ones that we probably need to communicate. So as an example, let's say you're meeting someone for the very first time, maybe it's like a friend of a friend, and you might let them know that you're more of a handshaker than a hugger. Because for you, one of your physical boundaries is that you don't hug people unless you have a certain type of relationship with them. Fair enough. I consider that bodily autonomy. You can decide whatever you like. But that type of boundary you might actually have to tell someone about, because some people, like me, are big huggers, and we kind of naturally hug everybody unless they ask me not to. And then, of course, I don't hug people that don't want to be hugged. Now, we all know that setting boundaries isn't easy. And for the feminine especially, that often comes down to us feeling like we might seem needy or stuffy or maybe overly sensitive, or we worry that setting a boundary might actually harm the relationship in some way or make it very awkward going forward. And as a general rule, women will do almost anything we can to avoid that icky feeling, that feeling that there's going to be damage done. I have been taught in one of the relationship programs that I do that women, as a general rule, we think of every relationship we have in this world as being like a rope that connects us. So I might have a rope between me and each of my children, a rope between me and my husband, me and my mom, me and my sister, me and my friend. And every time I interact with those people, I always subconsciously somewhere am making sure that that rope is intact, that that relationship is okay. And oftentimes when we feel the need to assert a boundary, we worry that we might be fraying that rope. And women, we will do just about anything that we can to not fray that rope. And what I want to reassure you of is that setting boundaries doesn't fray ropes. So if that analogy made sense to you, it doesn't. If we don't set boundaries, then in the long run, it's actually super counterproductive because we end up exhausted often and in resentment because we are doing things that we don't want to be doing. So you have to be willing to trade a little bit of short-term discomfort just because it feels weird to do it if you've never done it before for some really great long-term relationships. So with women, because we can have boundary issues on one of two spectrums. You can actually have a boundary issue where your boundaries are too porous, meaning that you don't really have any, or they're super flexible, or you don't ever enforce them. Or we can have boundaries that are too rigid, meaning we're actually putting up walls to prevent us having meaningful relationships with people or coming across as emotional or needy. And so with women, we tend to fall more on the porous side. So often we have non-existent boundaries or very porous boundaries, which can lead you to being vulnerable to absorbing other people's needs and emotions as your own. And many of you, especially if you identify as an empath, can really feel that, where we take on other people's stuff. And that is also a problem. Think about this long term. That is not healthy for you. Okay, so that's one way you can have not so great boundaries or not have boundaries at all. Rigid is the opposite, where you can eventually end up feeling isolated and alone. And maybe like emotionally apart from all other people around you. So when we talk about both of those, let's talk about porous boundaries first. So these usually come from people having a lack of emotional separation. And that's where that whole empath empathy thing comes in, where we don't have the ability to separate our emotions from other people's, and so someone's feeling something and then we take it on. It can lead to relationships that are a little bit dependent, so some dependency can happen there. Or what I see all the time is a bit of a people-pleasing attitude. So we'll do whatever we can to make everybody else around us feel really good. And those of us who suffer from porous boundaries really need to work on reclaiming our autonomy and speaking up for ourselves. On the other hand, on the very other side of rigid boundaries, these people who have super rigid boundaries actually find it so hard to get close to people. Because those boundaries are like, I consider it like a shield of armor. They're just protective. So an example of a really rigid boundary would be ghosting someone that you've been dating because they opened up about how much they like you. And that's just too much feeling for you, and you just ghost them and end it. The solution for rigid boundaries, I actually think, to me it feels easier because I don't tend to have rigid boundaries, but is really just to practice expressing how you feel. So being able to verbalize that and asking for help when you need it, and allowing yourself to feel love and to love other people. Probably for someone with really rigid boundaries, that doesn't sound as easy as it sounds to me. But when we don't set clear boundaries, they have a way of making themselves known a little bit more indirectly. Anyone here know anyone who is often very passive aggressive? I can name a handful in my life. So someone who is often passive aggressive is using a very ineffective communication technique to communicate a boundary usually, but in a really bad way. So instead of just saying that they've been hurt by the words or actions of someone else, someone who's being passive aggressive will just act out how they feel and hope the other person figures it out. Right? Figures out what they've done wrong and does something differently. The problem with that is usually the person on the other side of it has no idea what just happened, or doesn't know how they triggered or set you off or hurt you in any sort of way. So that passive aggressive technique is what I call indirect communication. It is a way of trying to get your point across without actually saying what the point is. And so the solution, of course, is, I would say in all relationships, is to use direct communication. And women, we tend to struggle with this because we sugarcoat and soften edges of things because we don't want to hurt feelings, and we're always trying to keep that rope intact. But if you say exactly what you mean, and you can wrap these things in a kind and compassionate way, it doesn't have to be mean or jerky or like harsh in any way, but if you can communicate directly, or assertively is another word to say it, you don't have to be mean or angry, right? Or any of the other bad words you might have tied up with that energy or that idea, but you can say things exactly as they are. I always just remind myself, kind and compassionate, say my words in the most kind and compassionate way that I can, and I am not responsible for how someone else takes them, okay? So stay away from implied or indirect communication. We should just say it. And you can do that by using phrases that start with I. I want, I need, I expect. As an example, you could say to someone who's been asking you this question a lot, I'm sure some women in the group have heard this before, I want you to stop asking me when I'm going to get married. As an example. That's a form of that's a direct communication sentence. Also, when you're going to communicate something like that, which is a boundary, don't apologize or explain too much. It's not important. You don't have to do that. Your boundaries are not negotiable. If it's something that you've decided is important to you, is bothering you, is a line you need to draw in the sand, then just do it. Feel good about it. You're doing what's best for you. You should always celebrate that. You don't need to over-explain or apologize. We tend to do that as a way to try to soften the blow of the statement that we're making. So another way that we can help people to accept our boundaries, to be okay with this idea that we're going to maybe lay a few boundaries down, is to model good boundary respecting behaviors. I already mentioned up above, if someone ever said to me, I'm not a hugger, I am not going to hug them. I mean, any decent human would be like, yes, that's a boundary I can respect, right? Especially when someone says it nicely. Of course, I'm not going to hug them. So if you model good boundary respecting behavior, then people around you are more likely to honor yours, right? Do unto others as you would like to be done unto you. Now, I know a lot of you are feeling a little bit icky about verbalizing a boundary, because every time I talk to anyone about this, some people feel icky. I can feel it. And we often get a little bit hung up on our fears and worries, meaning we're doing some cartwheels in our head, we're thinking through scenarios, we're worrying about whether we might cause offense to someone, or maybe they'll perceive us in a negative light because now we have a boundary. But the truth is, when you're kind and polite, most people are very happy to respect your boundary. Most of you are not going to ask for anything unreasonable. We're just not that kind of people. And so for the people who won't respect your boundary, I really think you should reconsider maybe how much time you want to spend on that relationship or in that relationship. Because like I said, most decent humans are very okay with boundaries that you would want to set. They're usually for good reason. Now, there'll be times when issues are going to come up with your boundaries. So we can't have a conversation about boundaries unless we talk about discussing consequences for people violating those boundaries. Because just like anything in life, you could ask someone something nicely, so you could, lay that boundary out, and they may completely ignore you, either because they don't care what your boundary is, or because they literally forgot that you had requested that something not happen in a certain way. And so we have to talk about consequences, because just like with your team at the office, when I talk to you a lot about holding them accountable to the things you want them to do, you have to do the same thing with your boundaries. You have to make sure that if it's important to you, that you have consequences in place so that it's held up, so that people learn that that's the way you want to be treated, and then they treat you that way. So there's going to be times where one of your boundaries is violated in some way, and it's going to be a minimal infraction. And it's not bugging you, and you're just going to shrug it off and let it go, right? We don't have to be militant about it. But if you've got boundary violations that keep happening, especially with the same person over and over again, you really are going to want to do something about that, or you're going to be stuck. You're probably then stuck right where you were before you tried to set the boundary. And the idea of the boundary was probably to get out of whatever the circumstance was that you were in. So before you take any drastic measures or get all worked up or angry or upset, you're going to take a deep breath. And you're going to give people the benefit of the doubt. So the first thing you're going to do is just restate your boundary. For example, we always argue when we talk about politics. Can we please stick to other topics? Okay. So as an example, let's say I had a boundary with one of my girlfriends that we don't talk about politics, because it always turns into a heated battle, and I don't like spending my energy in that way with that person. And so maybe I've stated that. But yet when we get together, she keeps bringing up politics. Well, a great way to restate my boundary is just to say, we always argue when we talk about politics. Can we please stick to other topics, right? And then she's either going to respect that or not. And if she doesn't, then I get to decide what I do, right? And I'm going to get back to that in just a second. Here's another example for you. And this will help to illustrate some consequences, right? Now, consequences are not something that someone else does. I remember there was a comment on my boundary post, and someone said, well, what do I do when so-and-so, violates my boundary? They just aren't listening, right? They're not listening to me. Well, the consequence you're going to put in place is a consequence for you, an action you are going to take, because we can't make other people do anything. But we just can't. We only have control over ourselves. So let's say your mom keeps showing up unannounced at your house. And you have asked her to always call ahead. Okay, so she's violating this boundary. So what's a way that you could have a consequence that you enforce that involves you only to get her to understand that you mean it about the boundary of calling ahead before she shows up at your house? Well, maybe you just don't let her in. You don't answer the door. Whatever that is, right? That's an action that you can take to enforce that boundary. If she keeps coming unannounced and you keep letting her in the house, she's just going to keep doing it, right? So, as an example, another example, what if one of your boundaries is around the way someone communicates with you? Let's say you've set a boundary with someone that, like, yelling and screaming at you is not okay. That is not going to be tolerated. Then if that behavior comes up, what can you do? You can remove yourself immediately from that situation. And you might have to make a statement as well. And you can say something like, unless you can speak to me calmly, I will be removing myself from this conversation. Right? If that boundary is for you, then you got to figure out what you're going to do if someone's violating it. And not everybody would have the same boundaries. As an example, I don't care if someone's yelling and screaming at me. it's not something in this world that bothers me. But for some people, that's a huge trigger and a huge issue. And who cares why? If it's something that's important to you in your life and you just set that boundary, then set that boundary. Right? That's what you got to do. So the biggest takeaway here is that you can't make someone else do something that you want. I mean, we're all like, society is just trying to do that all the time, but you can't actually make, like, you can try to coerce someone. If you have power over someone, you can, get them to comply in the short term, but we can't really, like, make people do things. So you can ask for things in a kind and compassionate way, meaning you are responsible for your words and how they come out of your mouth. And then they get to decide if they want to do that thing, honor your boundary, whatever that is, or not. And then in return, it's like tennis, you then get to decide what you do. So, and this is powerful. Because if you think about it this way, it means you have all the power. And I love being empowered. Being an empowered woman is like one of my foundational concepts these days. So if you understand that it's all in your hands and that you have the power to set the boundary and to enforce the boundary, you've got all the power, right? No one else has any power over you. And I think that's actually one of the reasons that women especially avoid setting boundaries is we misunderstand what they are. We imagine that setting a boundary might distance ourselves, like emotionally, from a person. And we've often been indoctrinated to believe that relationships are about selflessly giving. Women have often been told that to be a good wife or a good mother, they must selflessly give to other people, and that is sort of their role. But I invite you to consider another perspective, which is that we cannot pour from an empty cup. So if all it is in your world is to give without any consideration for yourself, that is not sustainable. And many people are living in the results of that because they're exhausted and drained and resentful and life just doesn't feel good. So I want you to think about how you fill yourself up. What boundaries do you have in place for yourself? So let's take other people out of the picture. What boundaries do you have for yourself so that you can show up as your best self, right? Good self boundaries help to keep you from engaging in things that don't serve you, like buying things you don't need, as an example, wasting your time on frivolous distractions, as an example. Boundaries for yourself are about saying yes to you, treating yourself with respect, adopting good self-care practices for you. And I don't, when I say self-care, I don't just mean like spa days. That a spa day every now and again is super nice, but I mean being in tune with your own needs and values and desires and honoring those. That's way more important than going to the spa. So as an example of self-care, that could be saying no when you know you don't have time to do something. When you say no to the things that you can't do or you just don't want to do, because you can say no for that too, you'll have way more energy and enthusiasm and time for the things that you want to say yes to, for the things that are your priorities, that serve your values in your life. So, ladies, if you're feeling stressed or overwhelmed or burnt out, look at your current boundaries. Are they working? Do you have any? Are they enough? Do you need more? I'm not saying it's the only piece of the puzzle, the only thing you have to consider, but I think it's a really important piece of the puzzle. The best boundaries that I have put in place in the last 5 years have all been boundaries for me. Boundaries that protect my space, right? And most of my boundaries are around time because I gave everybody unlimited access to me. And that is no longer the case. People do not have unlimited access to me. I decide who has access to me. I decide when they have access to me. I decide for how long they have access to me. And I make no apologies for protecting my time so that I can put it where I want it to be, in the places that I think it will serve me and my priorities and my values best. And I encourage you to do the same thing if you think that that will serve you. So the key takeaways are this. There is nothing wrong with having boundaries, and healthy relationships should have boundaries. And those boundaries can be whatever you choose. There is actually no list of boundaries we should all have because we all live very different lives with very different priorities. And I think the first place to start may be just go inside. Figure out what boundaries you need for yourself. So you may have to put boundaries for yourself on behaviors you're trying to curb. Or, like I said, with me, a lot of my boundaries came to time and access of me. So a lot of my boundaries came down to figuring out what things I was going to say no to and when I was going to say no to them, and when I need time that's just for me that cannot be interrupted by anyone else, so I can focus and get shit done, so I have time for all the fun stuff like these, so I can come do Facebook Lives with you guys. And so I know that was probably a little bit academic, but I hope that was helpful for some people to clarify maybe why you feel a little bit icky about boundaries. Now you know why. Because all women do on some level. I want you to understand that it doesn't hurt relationships, it actually helps them. I want you to very much consider how you're communicating with people. Direct communication is hard for women because it is not our natural way of being. We tend to dance around things, and indirect communication is sort of how we were raised and what we were taught and what we witness. But if we can just be kind and compassionate and to the point, good things happen. And most of the people in this world are good people, and most people will respect any boundary that you lay down as long as, you know, it's reasonable and it makes sense. And only you can decide what that is. Now, I don't know what I'm going to talk about next week, because like I said, I kind of do this based on whatever pops into my world. So either I read something or I see something or something happens and I decide it's something worth talking about. So if you have an idea or something you'd really like me to talk about, shoot me a message. Like, email me, send me a DM, put a comment down below this video. I always love to hear what you guys want me to talk about. Maybe you have a particular challenge that's happening at the office with a team member. Or maybe you're trying a new marketing strategy and you're not sure if it's working or not. Whatever. I mean, it could be absolutely anything. I don't always have the perfect answers for all things, but I'm always happy to share the things that I've tried, the things that I know work, and do some digging if there's more information I can gather for you to help you along the way. And I'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.